Hello everybody and welcome back. I thought I'd share. I purchased this iron and it has the Vaughan and Bushnell logo on it. There's a football shape surrounded by a rectangle. And I purchased that iron for this hand plane. If you've watched my videos, you've seen me use it off and on several times as one of my number 4 users. And I have a whole series of videos on how I cleaned it, sharpened it, tuned it, and made it look like this. If you're interested, I invite you to go back and check them out. However, when I received this plane, it came with a Shapley hardware iron, which from what I understand was one of the many manufacturers of iron and steel products from days gone by. And that's a trademark that you can find if you look for it, but it says Shapley hardware. There's a DE with an arrow in it. This 804 on the chip breaker was how I actually identified this guy as Vaughan and Bushnell, model 804. So the chip breaker that I recently purchased doesn't seem to have an 804 on it. But I don't know for a fact that this iron was sold with planes like these back when they were sold, but I figure this is a closer representation of what this guy would have had. So without further ado, let's loosen this up and take a look. This chip breaker looks ordinary in every way, no markings on it that I can see, and I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use the original one I had because it has the 804 on it. And I will save this iron for some other use somewhere. It's interesting, this hole down here, instead of being round, is square. Something I never knew. And the condition of the blade, and it looks fairly rounded. That may take some effort. I don't want this to look new. The plane doesn't look very new. So, well, I cleaned it with a little soapy water and a Scotch-Brite pad, hit it with light sanding sponge and then some steel wool, and I think the trademark is looking pretty good, and I like the way that iron looks. I think it'll match the plane. And now we get to the fun part of sharpening, and I've said this before, whenever you run across an old iron, you hope that some previous owner had the knowledge, skills, and ability to flatten the backside just to make your life easier. But the first thing we're going to do is see just how flat the back is. And for that I'm going to use my 400 grit diamond stone. And that's not looking very flat. I am hitting basically the 2 edges on the perimeter. And it doesn't even look like I hit the very edge of the iron. Well, this is going to take a while. Well, I've been at it for about 10 minutes, and 5 minutes of that was to try to get a little bit more of this edge area a little flatter. There seems to be quite a hollow in the middle of the working area of this iron. It's kind of spoon-shaped, if you will. The edges are sticking up, and this middle area is recessed. I'm going to use my Veritas jig and a guide here. Establish a square 25-degree bevel. Like so. We'll do that again on the coarse diamond stones and see how lucky we get. And yeah, you can see just hitting the middle of the blade, this is very rounded. It's going to take quite a bit of grinding to get this to a primary bevel. Well, I've been at this about 5 minutes, and the good news is it looks like whoever ground their primary bevel, they got it at about 25 degrees. So that's a little less work for me, and you can see I am cleanly wearing away the inside, not touching the edges yet. So there was a bit of a belly in the middle of this bevel, not a very good bevel at all, so it was rounded on all 4 edges really. Well, it's been another 6 or 7 minutes. I almost have the bevel all the way to this edge, a little bit more to go, but more importantly, as you run a nail along it, there's a nick right here in the edge, and there's another bigger one here and another one here, and they correspond to a little bit of schmutz on this side of the iron, so I'm going to have to go quite a bit more to get rid of those as well. It's been about 15 minutes in total, maybe 20. It looks good, but the problem is as I run my finger across it, it feels like a serrated knife. There's an awful lot of pits, so I'm going to have to keep grinding till I reach some better steel. Well, I spent the better part of an hour and I flattened the back a little bit more, and I still have a couple pits along this very edge. It cuts in, but I can feel right there it's hitting something. And right there is still a pit around here and around here. So it's looking pretty good. I did a lot more flattening on the back. I have a smaller depression in there now. And this side is all okay. I can't feel any burrs. And if I do the paper test, it seems to cut pretty well. Well, I marched up from the finer and finer grits, as you've seen me do in many of my videos, so I didn't bother to show it, but that is quite sharp. Shaves very nicely. Paper test. Put a teeny bit of oil all over the steel. I'll protect it from rusting. Don't want to overdo it. You don't want it to be greasy, but also help the plane operate a little better. Places that are supposed to slide will slide a little better. So I have this set up, and I'm getting delightfully little wispy shavings. However, there's one showstopper of a problem. If I take a clean cut, I get this shaving and it's split. I don't know if you can tell, but I got two narrow shavings, and there's a very subtle groove in the middle of the board. But what happened is there is a pit in the center of the tip of the iron, and I didn't detect it with my paper test, and I didn't really see it, but I just opened it up and took a closer look at it, and there's a tiny pit right in there. And I'm going to have to take this off and do some more material removal on the bevel to get past that pit. Oh well, get a piece of paper to catch in it. Yeah, right there. So it's taken about a half hour or so of grinding. You can see all the iron dust down here. I've been constantly checking it with my magnifying, and I spent a little more time flattening the back of the iron, so that little hollow in there is getting a little bit smaller. And I think I have the pit finally gone, and we're ready for just honing and give it another test go. So let's take a minute to try to discuss what just happened. Do a little diagram here. This is a cross section of the plane iron as I was sharpening it, the surface here. And this angle here, 25 degrees, that's what I set it to, my choice, which means that this angle is also 25 degrees. Now let me add a third dimension to this diagram to give you an idea. This is the leading edge of the iron, and this heads back that way. So right in the middle here there was this little tiny pit. And I did my best to try to measure it with calipers, and I was getting a little area here at about 7/1000ths of an inch. The size of this pit was pretty tiny, and the question you have is how much of this material down here do you have to remove? Let me shade this in a little bit to get rid of that pit. The right triangle is right here. I'll take this, draw it here, and excuse my lack of precision by freehand. But it's something like this, and here's our 25 degrees. And the idea was I was measuring this area here, these 7/1000. There's a pit in here. So if this is 7/1000, the question is, what is this distance here? So let's take this guy, blow it over here, a nice big triangle. So this distance, 0.007 inches. We know that this is 25 degrees, and the big question mark is what is this distance? How much did we remove? So this is the right angle, which means this is the hypotenuse. So the tangent of 25 degrees, if you remember your high school trigonometry, equals the opposite over the adjacent, and the opposite is the quantity we're looking for, and the adjacent is 7/1000ths of an inch. And if we get out the handy-dandy calculator, so if you multiply both sides by 7/1000ths using algebra, 0.007 inches times tangent 25 degrees equals question mark. So we're in degrees, and if I put in 25 and take the tangent of that, that's 0.47 times 0.007, and we get about 3/1000ths. So because of the geometry, trigonometry of it all, I had to remove 3/1000ths off the cutting edge to get rid of that pit that was around 7, give or take a few thousandths. And that 3/1000ths or so wasn't necessarily just removing that edge. I also did remove a little bit of the material from the back. And now I'm just going to hone this up on the Waterstone This is 1,000 grit. You know, I think going forward I'm going to be a little more, I don't know if the word is open-minded, but maybe a little more cautious that there may be pits in the tip, because it was a lot of work to get rid of it by hand on the stones. I do have power tools that would have made it go a little quicker. However, I have had instances where there was black spots up here that didn't turn out to be pitting. It wasn't a hole in the metal, a pit. It was actually just a discoloration, a bit of a corrosion, a little speck of magnetite that had formed. I think I'm going to be a little more careful and try to look at that a little closer. So once again, I put a very thin coat of oil on the pieces of interest. Very carefully slide these together. Make sure that the chip breaker is perfectly lined up with the iron, and very gently coax that up to less than a millimeter or so, maybe half a millimeter. Get a nice square line there, so the chip breaker is well formed, the iron is square. And then if you squeeze this together, you can tighten it by hand pretty tight. And just to show you, if I put a screwdriver on it, maybe get about that much more. And in this plane, put it in, there's a fair amount of slop in the iron. So you also want to make sure that's well centered in the throat. And if it all works out, your lateral adjuster should be well centered. And then you very carefully line up the lever cap, keep that square, straight and true. All looks good. And snap her down. Okay, I just took a second to get it all set up. And on the right side, I get a beautiful shaving. And on the left side, I get an equally beautiful shaving. And again, this is poplar, so it's kind of easy stuff, but you get the idea. And that's out of the middle. So this is looking like it's going to be another great user. Looking forward to using it. This plane served me very well. I sharpened this to an honest 25 degrees. I didn't bother with any fancy tricks. I think those are fine. In the future, I may very well put a secondary or tertiary or back bevel on it for a quicker sharpening. But where this was sort of a maiden sharpening, I wanted to get an honest 25 degrees on it. My Veritas gauge actually allows, through this adjustment mechanism, to get a secondary and tertiary bevels. Fortunately, my waterstones are a little small for doing the David Charlesworth ruler trick, although it can be done. Well, I'm sure this guy's going to continue to be a solid user in my shop, and now that I know he's got a really sharp iron, I can't wait for the next opportunity where I need to reach for number 4. I'm kind of pleased it now has a slightly more appropriate iron. And that's all I got for now. So as always, I appreciate you coming by. If you've got any comments, anything, any questions, feel free to leave them below. And as always, stay posted for the next one.